I hit the floor so hard I tasted copper, and the first thing I saw was mashed potatoes smeared across my sleeve while 23 people pretended not to notice. My stepson Tyler stood over me with his hand still raised from the shove, his face twisted into something between rage and triumph, and he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "This seat belongs to my dad. Get out." The dining room went silent except for the sound of my wife Diane setting down her wine glass, and I waited for her to say my name, to tell him to stop, to do anything that would prove I wasn't invisible in my own house. She didn't. She grabbed a napkin and started wiping gravy off the hardwood like that was the real problem, like I wasn't still on my knees with cranberry sauce dripping down my shirt. And that's when I understood that this wasn't a fight I could win because I was the only one who thought we were fighting. I got up without a word, walked past the Christmas tree I'd spent 4 hours decorating, grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, and left while Tyler's biological father Chuck laughed about something in the kitchen. Nobody followed me. Nobody called. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 10 minutes watching the windows glow warm and gold, watching shadows move behind the curtains like nothing had happened, and then I drove to a motel off Highway 9 because I couldn't think of anywhere else to go. Let me back up because this didn't start on Christmas Eve. It started the day I married Diane 16 years ago and inherited a teenage kid who never wanted a stepfather. I'm Mark Henson, 56 years old, spent 32 years as a union machinist before my back gave out, and I was raised to believe your word is your bond and your home is your kingdom. My father sat at the head of our table every Sunday for 40 years until the cancer took him, and when he died I inherited that chair, a heavy oak piece he'd built himself in 1967, and I brought it to the house Diane and I bought together in 2009. It wasn't about power, it was about continuity, about being the man who keeps the roof solid and the bills paid and the fridge stocked. And for 16 years I did exactly that while Tyler grew from a sullen 17-year-old into a 32-year-old who still treated me like a temporary inconvenience. Diane always said he'd come around, that he just needed time, that his relationship with Chuck complicated things, and I believed her because the alternative was admitting I'd spent 16 years as a guest in my own life. The disrespect wasn't new, it just usually stayed small enough to ignore. Tyler would show up unannounced with Chuck in tow, and they'd drink beer in my garage and go quiet when I walked in like I'd interrupted something private. 2 weeks before Christmas, Tyler asked if Chuck could come to dinner, and Diane said yes without asking me. And when I pointed out that this was supposed to be immediate family, she gave me that look, the one that makes me the problem. "He's Tyler's father, Mark, don't start." Like I was the one creating tension, like I hadn't spent 16 years swallowing every insult and dismissal because I thought that's what you do when you love someone. Christmas Eve started normal enough. I spent the morning cooking ham and roasted vegetables and 3 kinds of potatoes because Diane's sisters always complained if there wasn't variety, and Tyler texted around noon saying he'd be late because he was picking up Chuck. Diane read the message and smiled, actually smiled, like this was good news, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. People started arriving around 4, Diane's sisters and their husbands and a handful of cousins I barely knew, and everyone complimented the food and made small talk that felt like static. I sat in my chair at the head of the table, the one my father built, and tried to feel like this was still my home. Tyler and Chuck showed up around 5:30, both of them loud and laughing, and Tyler made a beeline for the table and stopped when he saw me sitting there. "You're in the wrong spot, Mark." He said it casual, like a joke, but his eyes weren't joking. I stayed put and said I'd been sitting here for 16 years. And I felt Diane's hand on my shoulder, gentle but insistent, asking me to please just move to the side, just for tonight, just to keep the peace. I should have said no. I should have told Tyler this was my house and my chair, and if he couldn't respect that he could leave, but I didn't because I thought maybe one night wouldn't matter. So I moved. I sat at the side like a guest and watched Chuck settle into my chair like he owned it. And Tyler sat next to him, and they started talking about some fishing trip, and nobody seemed to notice or care that I'd just been demoted in my own home. Dinner started, and people passed dishes and made toasts and laughed at stories I wasn't part of, and I sat there with my plate getting cold, feeling smaller with every minute. Then Tyler stood up to get more wine, and I shifted in my seat, just adjusting because my back was cramping, and he turned around and saw me, and something in his face changed. "Why are you still sitting there?" His voice cut through the conversation, and everyone stopped talking. I didn't understand the question. I was sitting where Diane had asked me to sit, but before I could answer, he grabbed my chair and yanked it backward, and I lost my balance and went down hard, shoulder hitting first, and then my head bouncing off the floor, and the pain was immediate and sharp and humiliating. I lay there looking up at the ceiling, at the light fixture I'd installed 3 years ago, and I could hear someone gasp and someone else say Tyler's name in a tone that might have been shock or might have been warning. Tyler stood over me and said his piece about the chair belonging to his dad, and I waited for Diane to defend me, to tell him he'd gone too far, to help me up, but she grabbed that napkin and started cleaning and asked me in this tight, embarrassed voice to please just go calm down in the other room. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Tyler, apologize. Just go away," because I was ruining the evening. I got up slow because my shoulders screamed and my pride was shattered, and I walked out through a room full of people who suddenly found their plates very interesting. Chuck called after me something about not being able to take a joke, and Tyler laughed, and I kept walking. I took my jacket and left, and my phone stayed silent the entire drive to the motel, not a single call or text, and I realized that I'd been erased from my own family without anyone bothering to tell me. The motel room smelled like bleach and cigarettes someone had tried to hide with air freshener, and I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing my gravy-stained shirt, trying to figure out how I'd let it get this far. My phone buzzed once around midnight, a text from Diane saying we'd talk tomorrow. Like this was just another argument we'd smooth over with apologies I'd be expected to make. I didn't respond. I lay down fully clothed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and wondered when exactly I'd stopped being a husband and started being an obstacle. And I couldn't pinpoint the moment because it hadn't been sudden. It had been erosion, 16 years of small cuts. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning, and when I woke up 6 hours later, my phone showed 23 missed calls and a text from my credit union asking me to contact them immediately about suspicious activity on an account I didn't know existed. The credit union opened at 9, and I was standing outside the door at 8:50 wearing the same shirt from last night because I hadn't gone home to change. And when Melissa Grant called me back to her desk, she had that look people get when they're about to ruin your day, but it's technically not their fault. She pulled up an account I'd never seen before, showed me a loan for $47,000 taken out 6 weeks ago with my signature as co-signer, and my first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion because I hadn't signed anything since refinancing the house in 2019. It was a consolidation loan tied to Tyler's small business equipment, and my credit was the only reason it got approved. Melissa rotated her monitor so I could see the application form, and there was my name in blue ink, Mark Henson, right next to Tyler Brooks as primary borrower, and the signature looked close enough that I understood immediately why the bank had approved it. Then she showed me the security question they'd used to verify identity over the phone, and it was my father's middle name, Joseph, something I told Tyler once years ago when he'd asked about the chair. He'd remembered. He'd saved that information and used it to steal $47,000. And the loan was already 30 days past due, which meant it was about to wreck my credit score that I'd spent 3 decades building. I sat in that chair trying to process what this meant, that the humiliation on Christmas Eve hadn't been the end of something. It had been the beginning, that Tyler hadn't just disrespected me. He'd planned this, had gone through paperwork and phone calls and deliberate fraud, using a piece of my father's memory as the key. Melissa asked if I wanted to dispute the signature, and I heard myself say yes before I'd fully thought it through. And she printed forms and explained the process, how it would trigger an investigation, how law enforcement might get involved, how this would become official and permanent. She slid the papers across her desk and handed me a pen, and I held it for a long moment thinking about what signing meant, that it meant I was choosing truth over family, choosing my name over Tyler's future, choosing to stop absorbing damage. I signed the fraud report and dated it December 26th, and Melissa made copies and told me someone would contact me within 72 hours, and I walked out of that credit union knowing I'd just declared war on my own stepson. My phone had been buzzing all morning, but I'd ignored it, and when I finally checked, there were texts from Diane asking where I was, asking why I was being dramatic, asking if I was really going to ruin Christmas over a chair. Not one word about the shove, not one acknowledgement that maybe Tyler had crossed a line. There were 3 texts from Tyler too, all with that false casual tone people use when they know they've screwed up but won't admit it. The second one said, "You've always been cool about stuff before, don't change now." I read them twice and felt something shift in my chest. This cold clarity that 16 years of being cool about stuff had taught Tyler that I'd always be cool about stuff, that there was no consequence too big for me to absorb. I drove to the VFW hall, where my friend Walt Keegan runs the morning coffee crew. Walt took one look at me and poured 2 cups, and we sat in the corner booth while I told him everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time before he said, "This isn't a family drama, Mark, this is a scheme." He pulled out his phone and showed me how to back up messages to the cloud, how to create a paper trail that couldn't be erased. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything, and the pattern was obvious once I looked for it. Tyler had been gathering information for months, asking casual questions about my credit score and banking habits, and I'd answered because I thought we were building a relationship when really he'd been measuring me for theft. My phone rang around 4, and it was Diane. Before I could say hello, she launched into a speech about how I'd embarrassed her by leaving, how her sisters were asking questions, how Tyler felt terrible. I let her finish and then asked her about the loan, said the bank had called me about a $47,000 debt I didn't know existed, and the silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, gotten smaller, and she asked how I'd found out. Not, what loan? Not, that's impossible. Just how did I find out, which meant she'd known. She tried to explain it in that rush of words people use when they're caught. Said Tyler had been desperate. Said he'd needed the money to save his business. Said she'd told him it was wrong, but he'd insisted I'd never notice because the payments were set up automatically from an account she'd opened in my name. The account was new, paperless, and Diane had been intercepting the mail. When I asked how she'd gotten my signature, she admitted she'd practiced copying it. Said it had only taken a few tries. Said she'd done it to protect our family because Tyler's business failing would have devastated him. She admitted she was terrified of Tyler spiraling and even more terrified of confronting Chuck. I asked her why she hadn't just asked me for the money, and she said, "Because you would have said no. Mark, you always say no when it comes to Tyler." And I realized she'd known I'd say no and had decided my opinion didn't matter enough to even ask. She told me not to do anything rash, said if I just came home we'd work it out, and I told her I'd already filed a fraud report and the bank was investigating. She sucked in a breath and asked if I understood what that meant, if I knew I was destroying Tyler's life. And I said he destroyed mine first and hung up. The detective called 2 days later, a guy named Morrison who asked me to come to the station with any documentation I had. I showed up with a folder full of bank statements and screenshots. Morrison looked through everything methodically, comparing signatures, checking dates, and after 20 minutes he leaned back and said the signature was obviously forged, that this would move forward to the district attorney. He asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said yes without hesitation. People think fraud is a white-collar thing, but what your stepson did was steal your identity and your father's memory to finance whatever he couldn't afford, and that's not a family issue, that's a crime. He gave me a case number and told me to prepare for pushback, and I walked out feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. That night, I sat in the motel room listening to my voicemail fill up with messages from Diane's family telling me I was tearing the family apart. Tyler left one message, his voice tight with rage, saying I'd always paid for things before. That was the deal. I paid, and he tolerated me. And now I was breaking the deal over money like some kind of cheapskate. He called me weak, called me petty, said his real father would never do this to him. And I saved that voicemail. Then there was one from Chuck, his voice calm in a way that felt like a threat, saying I should think very carefully about what I was doing, that families protect each other. I deleted nothing and backed everything up twice. And then my phone buzzed with a text from Diane's sister Rebecca, someone I barely spoke to, and the message just said, "You need to hear this," with an audio file attached. I almost didn't listen to it, but something made me click play. The audio was scratchy like it had been recorded from another room, and I heard Tyler's voice first saying he'll pay for it. He always does. And then Diane saying, "But what if he checks the account?" And Tyler laughing and saying, "He won't, Mom. The guy's too weak to even look at his own mail. We could run this 3 more times before he noticed." There was more, about me being convenient, about me being easy to manipulate, about how they'd planned the Christmas confrontation to shake me up before the first loan payment came due, so I'd be too emotional to think straight if I found out. I listened to the whole thing twice before I understood that my wife and stepson had been running a con on me for months. Rebecca called me 3 hours later, crying, explaining that she'd been visiting Diane 3 weeks before Christmas and had walked in on them talking in the kitchen, that something about their tone made her leave her phone recording on the counter when she pretended to step outside, that she'd been too afraid to send it until now. I told her the recording was enough, that she'd given me proof that I wasn't crazy, and I forwarded the file to Detective Morrison within 10 minutes. Morrison called back within the hour saying this changed everything, that premeditation turned financial fraud into conspiracy, that the district attorney would want this for trial. Over the next 2 weeks, I repeated the same truth until it stopped sounding strange. I met with a lawyer named Sarah Brennan who specialized in identity theft, and told me my case was textbook except for the family component, which made it messier emotionally but cleaner legally. The investigator told me cases like this move fast when the paper trail is clean and the intent is obvious. Tyler hired his own lawyer who sent me a threatening letter, and Sarah laughed when she read it and said that's what people do when they have no defense. Diane called me 63 times in those 2 weeks, and I answered none of them, though I didn't block her number because Sarah told me to keep all communication as evidence. Her voicemails went from angry to pleading to coldly practical, talking about separation terms. Not reconciliation, not therapy, just the logistics of ending 16 years like we were dissolving a business partnership. The preliminary hearing happened on an icy morning in February in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and anxiety. I sat in the gallery watching Tyler walk in with his lawyer and Chuck right behind him like a bodyguard. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Sullivan who looked perpetually annoyed, and she went through the evidence quickly: the forged signature, the fraudulent account, the security question using my father's name. Tyler's lawyer argued that this was a misunderstanding between family members, that his client had assumed he had permission, that Mark Henson had a history of financially supporting Tyler. I felt my face get hot because that argument was technically true. I had given Tyler money over the years, but I'd given it, he hadn't taken it, and there's a universe of difference between those two things. Then Sarah stood up and asked to play an audio recording, and the judge allowed it. And Tyler's voice filled that courtroom saying he'll pay for it. He always does, and Diane responding, but what if he checks the account? And Tyler laughing and saying he won't, Mom. The guy's too weak to even look at his own mail. The room went quiet after that, the kind of quiet where you can hear people breathing, and Judge Sullivan looked at Tyler for a long moment before asking his lawyer if he wanted to revise his statement about this being a misunderstanding. The lawyer said something about context, but you could see it was over, that the recording had killed any chance of painting this as a family dispute gone wrong. The judge reviewed the signature analysis, looked at the dates, looked at the payment history showing Tyler had never made a single payment, and then she said the evidence supported probable cause for fraud and identity theft, and the case would move forward to trial. She set a court date for April and dismissed us, and I walked out knowing I'd won the first battle. Tyler caught up to me in the parking lot and grabbed my arm, his face red and twisted, and he said, "You're really going to do this? You're going to destroy me over money." I pulled my arm free and told him he destroyed himself the moment he signed my name. And Chuck stepped between us and told me I was making a mistake. That family doesn't turn on family. And I looked at both of them and said, "You're right, family doesn't, which is why I know exactly what you are." The trial happened in late April and lasted 2 days. Tyler's defense tried to paint me as vindictive, as someone who'd never accepted Tyler as a real son, who was using this as an excuse to punish him for Christmas Eve. Sarah let them talk and then showed the timeline, proved that the loan application had been submitted 6 weeks before Christmas, that the fraud had started long before any argument about seating arrangements, that Tyler had planned this systematically and used my father's memory as a tool. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on 2 counts of identity theft and 1 count of fraud, and Tyler's face went white when the judge read the sentence: 18 months in county jail and restitution of $47,000 plus legal fees. Diane wasn't in the courtroom, hadn't shown up to either day of trial, and I learned later she'd filed for divorce the same week the verdict came down. I moved my stuff out of the house on a Saturday in May while Diane was at her mother's, and the only thing I really wanted was my father's chair. It was still at the head of the dining room table where Chuck had sat on Christmas Eve, and I loaded it into my truck bed carefully, wrapped in blankets so it wouldn't get scratched, and drove it to the apartment I'd rented near the river. The apartment was small, just 1 bedroom and a kitchen that barely fit a table, but it was mine, every square foot of it was mine, and I set the chair by the window overlooking the water and sat in it for the first time in 5 months. It felt different than I remembered, heavier maybe, or maybe I felt lighter, and I sat there watching the sun go down over the river thinking about what I'd lost and what I'd kept. Rebecca called me a few days later and said Diane was telling people I'd ruined Christmas, ruined Tyler's life, ruined the family over pride and a piece of furniture, and I asked Rebecca what she thought. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I think you're the only one who tried to keep the family together, Mark. Everyone else was just using it as cover." That felt like closure, like permission to stop carrying guilt that was never mine to begin with. Tyler sent me 1 letter from county jail, 3 pages of rambling justification about how I'd had so much and he'd had so little, how it wasn't fair that I got to play father without earning it, how the money should have been is anyway, because Diane was going to inherit half of everything when we divorced. I read it once and threw it away because there was nothing in those pages I needed to respond to. Just a 32-year-old man still blaming everyone else for the consequences of his choices. I still sit in my father's chair most evenings, still feel the weight of what it represents. But now it's different because I'm not performing authority or claiming space I have to defend. I'm just sitting in a chair my father built in a home that's actually mine. People ask if I regret it, if destroying my marriage and my stepson's future was worth $47,000, and I tell them it was never about the money. It was about the moment I realized I'd spent 16 years being convenient, being the person who absorbed damage so everyone else could stay comfortable. And one day I decided I'd rather be alone than be a doormat, rather be honest than be welcome. I didn't lose a family. I stopped pretending I had one. And that's not the same thing at all. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.